So thank you, everybody, for giving me the opportunity to come up and speak. Thanks to the CoreOS team. So my job today is to put a little bit of perspective around what's going on in the industry. So most of the folks in this room, the mere fact that you're here, you're either using or you're interested in Kubernetes, you're probably already using container technology in some capacity, indicates you're among not only the leading, but potentially the bleeding edge of the industry. So you're pretty far out there, and a lot of your colleagues in other parts of the world, other parts of the industry, are potentially not nearly as far along as you are. So what I'd like to do is just before I go push into my slides, I'd like to just, if you would indulge me and just give me answers to a couple of questions. The one is, how many of you have containers in use today? Maybe almost half or a little less than half. And those of you who have containers in use, how many of you have orchestration in place, whether it's Kubernetes or some other form of orchestration? Great, most of you. Okay, and one final question on that theme, and that's for those of you that have containers and orchestration in use, how many of those installations configure, if you will, a logical application, or are they just simply small components that are appending onto other applications? So not just a few have logical applications. Great, great. That helps a lot. And one other question for everyone. How many of you are building applications that potentially have to be web scale? I mean, you have an unlimited number of users that may be hitting this application. Okay, more people than I would have expected. Great, thank you. I appreciate that very much. So what I want to cover today, there's three areas. I want to talk about digital transformation and the impact in the industry and where containers fit into that picture. Then we'll talk a little bit about open source software. I mean, open source software has been such a game changer, and frankly, in fact, most of what we're talking about today wouldn't have even been possible without open source software. And then I'll drill in a little bit more on containers and container orchestration, and then we'll finish up with some guidance that we think is relevant for all of you in the room here today. Okay, so digital transformation. In our industry, it's a really big talking point right now. When we think about digital transformation, it's something which has been actually happening for a long time. It's not like we woke up in January of 2016 and decided that we needed to make a transformation of our systems. This transformation actually has been going on for the last 20 or 30 years. And the way you think about it is, what does that transformation look like? So for example, the first thing we've gone through is we've had this standardization of infrastructure, or the hardware. If you go back in the 1980s, we had a whole variety of systems, just about all of them were proprietary. As we got into the 1990s or late 1980s, early 1990s, RISC systems came along. We had Unix operating systems, which were arguably not quite standard, but certainly somewhat interoperable. You had the ability to bring an application from Solaris to AIX to HPUX if absolutely necessary, but it had some pain associated with making that movement. But we started to have the ability to leverage and have some scale on how we built things. As we got into the 1990s, x86 architectures came along, in which at first a lot of the large system vendors laughed at x86 as being a relatively small architecture that would never scale, would never give the performance, the reliability, and so forth. And of course, over time, that's been proven to be wrong. But there's other things that happened in terms of standardization. We moved to a fairly small number of operating systems, where on x86, we had Windows and Linux. Those were primarily the operating systems that we had in use. So it started to create this infrastructure where we actually had a fair amount of standardization happening already. And that's the beginning of a continuum that takes you to cloud. So eventually you have an infrastructure which internally, for your systems that are in your data center, look more and more like the infrastructure which is going to be in the public cloud. So the second piece of it is the notion of interconnection of systems. And of course, in the 1990s, we started interconnecting systems as soon as the internet was commercially viable. And today, most systems are interconnected. But are they necessarily integrated? So does the intelligence of one system that you have operating share that intelligence with other systems that you have? And the chances are, in many cases, the answer may be no, or maybe yes in a limited fashion. So this ability for us as an industry to continue to take all these different pools of information, these different areas of knowledge that we have in our organization, and start to roll them together and allow one source of information to be used to help make the better decisions in another part of the business. That's part of what really has to happen at this point going forward. So there's another piece which we think is really fascinating. At IDC, we look at intellectual property, and we are seeing this, what we think is a pretty substantial change, where the intellectual property, it used to be you would buy a piece of software, you buy a license to use a piece of software from a vendor, and you would use the software for whether it was 5 years or 10 years or maybe even longer. And that's where the value came from, was that intellectual property you were able to acquire. But going forward, the intellectual property is increasingly embedded into the things that we use rather than the things we specifically buy. So for example, if you buy a modern car, it's got a lot of intellectual property in it already in terms of, the transmission, for example, is run by electronics rather than by speed and vacuum and that sort of thing. There's a lot of telemetry data which is captured by modern cars, which is sent upstream to the car manufacturers and the people that do aftermarket maintenance and so forth. And if you've got something really sophisticated like a Tesla, obviously there's a lot more intelligence built into the car. And all of our cars are going to look like that at some point in time. So this notion of where's the intellectual property, it's increasingly not in a software package we buy, but rather it's in the back-end system that supports the things we're using and the things we're doing. The same is true for cloud services. So you go and you consume certain cloud services, whether they're data services or analytics services or IoT services from, I don't care if it's Amazon or if it's Microsoft or it's Google. Those, again, are intellectual property features or resources that you're using, but you're not actually subscribing, you're not buying software, you're actually consuming those services. So that's really a sea change in how intellectual property is being delivered. So the next piece, this notion of data. There is data coming from every which direction. So we've got social and mobile data. The mobile data, of course, has been around for a few years, and the social data is becoming increasingly important. And if you had any question about how important social data was, the election cycle we've just been through really indicates how impactful social data can really be. But IoT and other forms of data is going to be very important too. And frankly, I don't think that the half of the IoT data which is going to be coming in and bringing that knowledge into your systems is even piped in at this point. So as that continues to evolve, that creates this environment where you can start to actually make use of the ability to make decisions around what that data is providing to you. So this ability to do decision support and do real-time analytics becomes really important. And one of the things I was thinking about as I was preparing to come up here and speak, for the audience in this room, a lot of you are in the financial services business, and I would think that when a market moves or when a stock goes up or down, you care a lot about that. And suddenly we're finding that Twitter, and for example, if President-elect Donald Trump tweets about a company or about a market or about a relationship with another country, it's suddenly moving the markets up and down rather suddenly. And that becomes an input for your trading systems where you need to decide if there's this type of a social remark being made, it's liable to drive a stock this direction or that direction. And those are the sorts of things that companies like yours do to make money or make more money. And doing it better than your competition is how you really make a difference. So it's pretty fascinating to me how these things have changed. So this is a diagram that IDC uses. I apologize for the size of some of the text in there, but I'll kind of read through it. This is the notion of what we call the third platform of computing. And if the third platform exists, there must have been a first and a second. And think of the platforms as a compute model together with a device, an access device model together with an interconnection fabric. So first platform, mainframes, interconnection was hardwired, access device was terminals. Second platform, distributed systems, so Unix, Linux, Windows, x86, access through local area networks, wide area networks, primarily through PCs as the access device of choice until more recently we've got a lot more mobile devices. And today with third platform, we're really looking at a back end which is increasingly, and not always, but increasingly becoming a cloud, whether it's a specific general purpose cloud or whether it's an industry-specific cloud. So some of the things that are in here, there are accelerators that are helping move the markets forward and move customers into this third platform era more quickly. So things like next generation security, augmented reality and virtual reality. And there's a really good case in point where virtual reality and augmented reality is likely to impact segments of the industry. For example, what happens to the entertainment industry and what happens when you can get a roller coaster experience by putting on an AR or a VR headset rather than going to a theme park and riding on the roller coaster. That suddenly the opportunities to sell services or sell an experience to customers changes fairly dramatically. Some of the other things, the Internet of Things is on there, cognitive and artificial intelligence, robotics, and 3D printing. They're all going to be drivers that are going to help accelerate this move to the third platform. And across the top, there's notion of the industry cloud. So we're seeing the emergence of industry-specific clouds for things like healthcare and financial services and retail and government and energy, where multiple companies will come together and say, we really need these types of specialized services that we can't get from a generic cloud. And the notion of building these industry-specific clouds, which, by the way, might not necessarily be a unique cloud and a new building. It may live on an Amazon or a Google infrastructure. It's just something which is very specific and has services that are optimized for a particular industry. So that's the sort of thing we're seeing happen. And so some of the things that for all of you, as you try to make sure that you remain competitive in this changing environment, obviously you have to embrace this standardized infrastructure, and you've done that already. You will continue to do that going forward, and the mere fact that you're looking at using container technology, you're looking at using orchestration technology such as Kubernetes suggests that you're going down that continuum just fine, and that's great. Modernizing your applications is all part of that, and part of it is also moving to a different operational model. So we're moving to a model where DevOps becomes part of the normal mode of operation for organizations. And frankly, that makes sense. It allows you to have agility, but it doesn't necessarily work as well for some of the old stuff you have in place, which, by the way, is going to be around for a long time to come. I mean, when you think about what happens with the first platform and the second platform, the first platform may have gone out of popularity 30, 35 years ago, but I don't know, I bet a lot of you folks have mainframe systems. You probably have potentially some IBM I systems in place. You probably even have some VMS at some place or another in your organization. And it's not because those things are, they have business value. It's the logic, it's the application logic which are on those systems that have value. And frankly, they continue to have value going forward. We think the same thing remains true for second platform for a fairly long period of time. We're going to have continued value coming from second platform applications as we move into this third platform era. So the notion of having this standardized infrastructure, it allows you this ability to be flexible and agile. You can move very quickly. And by the way, this allows you to disrupt your competitors. If you can do something better, faster, and more efficiently than your competitors can, it gives you the opportunity to steal business away from them, close markets, close deals, and so forth. And again, it gives you the other thing, it gives you the deployment flexibility that allows you to move your applications from your internal private cloud to an external public cloud and back again, and do it easily and reliably. So there's another thing that really happens here. This is something that happens that it affects not just simply the end user companies, but it affects the IT suppliers as well. And in some cases, some of your core suppliers are going to be impacted pretty heavily by these changes taking place. And I'll try to run through these. And on the left side of the chart, you're looking at the impact or the pressures or the benefits for the end user organizations. On the right side, what your suppliers and your vendors are experiencing. So the first one, competitors emerging and disrupting the quote-unquote business as usual. For the suppliers that you're using, they're facing the same problem where the customer base they have are buying different things. The ability to sell servers and sell basic infrastructure software, meaning operating systems and virtualization software and management tools, is becoming more difficult simply because the users are moving to this paradigm where they're starting to consume more stuff in cloud, and especially startups. Most startups today never buy any IT. They build everything in cloud from day one. The second row, so legacy IT. You've got to support it, and it doesn't really roll well into a DevOps scenario, and it certainly doesn't. You can't containerize your mainframe applications and roll them over to the Amazon cloud. So these sort of things are really, they're going to be a problem that you're going to have to support this for a long period of time, which creates complexities for your organization simply because you've got two different sets of infrastructure you have to support. For the IT vendors, again, it's a cash cow for them, but at the end of the day, that doesn't help them transition to third platform. Talent is hard for both user companies and for IT vendors. That's part of the nature of emerging technology. Off-prem IT investments, sometimes they're hard to justify. On-prem IT investments are hard to justify simply because do you really want to build a new data center when you can rent one? On the vendor side, they look at this and say, well, this is a race to zero because at the end of the day, the basic cloud services don't necessarily bring that much revenue certainly to the specialty suppliers that you use. Emergence of new technologies, they're emerging very, very quickly. Oftentimes, it's hard to even figure out what the return on investment is going to be before you're moving on to the next thing. The vendors themselves, they face that too. Again, the revenue opportunity is tough for them. And finally, installed applications. So you've got this, I mentioned earlier, this installed base of applications. You're faced with how do you support these things over the long term? And for the vendors, they're looking at it and say, well, we can't make any money in this space. So some of your vendors are probably not even going to be around 5 years from now, which is something that's of concern. So the next thing I want to talk about, so I've got a series of slides that present some data. And this is a snapshot we took a little earlier this year looking at companies that are moving into a DevOps scenario. And we were asking them what types of, so for example, what kind of tools are they using, what kind of challenges are they facing, where are the operational concerns and so forth. So we'll hit on a few different slides that look like this. The way to read this slide is that the light blue is companies that are purchasing more of that particular technology. And I apologize, there's a logo, there's a icon which apparently disappeared for some reason. Should be a dark blue, which says purchasing less. So if you look at the top, for example, IT operations and analytics tools, 55% of the people are purchasing more, and 32% of the people say they're purchasing less of that. So if you look at the top three areas, these analytics and orchestration, in-house automation and orchestration, application performance, people are spending a fair amount of their budget on those types of tools as opposed to decreasing their spending there. Same thing's true in terms of some of the web services they're using, so the platform services, the private cloud, and public IaaS, for example, that's up. If you get down to the bottom of this chart, you see that things flip. So for example, testing tools and in-house storage, people are actually spending less money on that. There are more people say they're spending less than they're spending more. So that shift is taking place as customers are moving toward this new paradigm. So we'll switch gears and let's talk a little bit about open source technology. And I've been following open source since I joined IDC back in 1999, and it's been an interesting scenario. Back in the early 2000s, people had told me open source would basically take over the world. And I had a hard time believing that because there were an awful lot of things that I just couldn't see how they would be built using open source software. The fact of the matter is that most of the infrastructure layers at this point have been built or rebuilt using open source software. But one of the things that's most fascinating to me is that open source software is no longer performing a follow-ship role. In other words, as we were building Linux in the early days, Linux was about recreating a Unix-like experience in open source. But today, that's not the case. So things like Kubernetes and Docker and Hadoop and things like that are all open source technologies that are actually bringing the industry forward and are not emulating anything that existed in proprietary software. So it's a really interesting shift in the market. This particular chart is just a look at operating systems and how that trend has gone over the last several years. And the green and the red are Linux, the green being non-paid, the red being the paid Linux component. And the portion of the market where servers being deployed with Linux have continued to grow. And a lot of that's been can thank the build out on public cloud infrastructure. So, but again, open source software has become the thing that's going to drive the industry going forward. So I think I mentioned the second point about crossing that midpoint. This notion of open source first, most organizations really see open source as being where they start today, and there's no concerns about it. And even Microsoft, which long fought open source software, today is embracing it in a way I never would have believed, but it's really great to see because they would have been fairly irrelevant in cloud going forward if they weren't able to embrace open source software. So here's another one of those slides from that survey that we conducted, and this one was asking about the organization's preference for sourcing options in terms of the types of products they would want to see used in a DevOps world. And the thing that I think is really fascinating for me is this top line, is that 45% of the people ranked having commercial or vendor-supported open source software. So in other words, think of that as things like getting Tectonic from CoreOS or getting RHEL from Red Hat. It's open source technologies that are being commercialized and being commercially supported so that the end user organizations can consume this stuff. The second one down here, the community-based free open source. So people use that, but the interesting thing is they're much more likely to be gravitating toward the commercial products. And I have to say that from my point of view, I think that's the right thing to be doing because you don't want to be in the business of maintaining the Linux kernel, or you don't want to be in the business of applying patches or having to have people on staff who have to worry about that sort of thing. You're much better off basically what we heard this morning from the first presentation, you really want to be about writing the software rather than writing the tools that actually make the software run. So we think that's pretty important. Okay. Applications really become the pivot point. Obviously applications don't jump ship. So Linux applications stay on Linux. They're going to stay that way for a long time. Windows applications are going to stay on Windows. Now, Microsoft, of course, brought Docker support and container support out on Windows Server 2016, not so long ago. And they've got orchestration support for Kubernetes and Mesos and a lot of other things in the Azure cloud, which I think is pretty amazing. But the applications themselves have to start to go different places. So we've got existing applications. One of three things has to happen to them. Either they have to go into an IaaS deployment, and I think an awful lot of current applications in market will do just that. They'll get wrapped up into a VM, they'll get parked in IaaS in somebody's cloud, and they'll be used for a long period of time as a resource. One thing that I do think will happen is that we're going to wrapper them with some kind of an API infrastructure so that we can get at those applications and get business value out of the application without necessarily touching the application itself. So as we write these, if you will, containerized microservice-based applications, we can start to consume data or content from these existing second and first platform applications that are out there to get value from them. The second one is the notion of lifting and shifting existing applications. When we talk to companies that are using containers today, more often than not, we find that they're actually picking up existing monolithic applications, plunking them into a container, and running them. And one of the things that's interesting about that is because they're running a single application that runs in a single container, they don't necessarily need orchestration. So in many cases, they're not using orchestration, at least the way we expect them to. In the future, we're expecting the use of orchestration to grow dramatically as they build cloud-native applications that actually were built to run in this kind of an environment. And finally, the third one, in some cases, those applications will be replaced by cloud-native applications. I don't think that's going to be the primary way of these things being changed over the next few years. Maybe 10 or 15 years from now might be the case, but not today. So I think we touched on most of these points. Cloud-native and open source pretty closely intertwined there. OK, so let's talk about containers and orchestration specifically. So this migration that we've been through, this progression we've gone through in the industry, we've gone through this scenario where we had, if you will, a best of breed. We chose our storage and our network infrastructure. We chose our hardware. We chose our infrastructure, software, middleware, and applications. And each piece was chosen for specific attributes or specific manageability on your part. And over the last decade or so, we've moved to a scenario where much of that stuff has been consolidated in open source. And increasingly, that open source layer is starting to pull those pieces together so that you make fewer individual decisions within that larger stack. So you don't necessarily take your open source operating system and subtract out that and not use the orchestration and the container technology that's packaged with it. You're probably going to use all of the components from a single vendor. And that makes a lot of sense. And as we go forward, it starts to move to a scenario where we've got a service provider which offers us either PaaS or SaaS services, and our applications can either run there or we start to put our containers in that infrastructure. And the interesting thing is you got this idea where you can actually take what you have today, lift those applications up, containerize them, and bring them right over and drop them into that infrastructure. So it makes sense from that perspective that we're going down this continuum, and I think that you're going to see that you're going to be doing that with both your existing applications as well as the new applications you're writing. The sort of things that you care about, though, so you're going to be asking questions like, what does it cost me to deploy this? And the question is no longer what is the hardware and software cost, but rather what's the availability, what's the service levels, what's the geolocation, what's my ability to bring things from point A to point B, or from your data center to my data center, or from their cloud to your internal private cloud, and so forth. Those sort of things are of a lot of concern. The other things you'll be thinking about is what does this mean in terms of application mobility? And by the way, serverless computing we see it as kind of the end game as we go down this continuum, where at some point you're not gonna have any server infrastructure or no new server infrastructure in your data center at that point. Okay, so here's another one of those snapshots of data that might be interesting for you. This is a question around what the technology challenges that organizations face when moving to a DevOps scenario, and again, using this orchestration container paradigm. So really the concerns are about the fragmentation, so the fragmented process that companies have. They have difficulty in moving to this type of an operational model. They find that their tools are not necessarily mature enough. The tools are not necessarily sophisticated. Security is a concern. Security is always a concern, right? I mean, we can kind of put that always at the top of almost every list. But in this case, it's a whole new situation where, because of the mobility and the ability of containerized applications to potentially move back and forth and spawn up new instances and so forth, this notion of having that firewall that rings around your data center and protects you doesn't really work anymore, and security has to be increasingly embedded into each and every containerized application. So a little contrast between smaller and larger organizations. Smaller organizations, they tend to think their workloads are not necessarily well suited for DevOps. And larger organizations, they tend to have that fragmented process challenge. Okay, one more slide on this. And this is a question of what the organization's governance and process challenges associated with DevOps. This top one, which stands out above everything else, and you probably know this because you live it every day, but the culture, the notion of how do we move from our classic waterfall methodology to a DevOps paradigm, a DevOps process, it's a big cultural challenge for most organizations. And there's no easy way around that, but what we find is that some organizations actually will take a group of people and they essentially sequester them or move them, in some cases spin them out into a funded startup, if you will, and put them to the task of building things in a very different way, not using the traditional waterfall process methodology, but rather going to this agile deployment and agile construction and deployment model. So in terms of the operational teams that are most likely to have difficulty with this kind of a shift, surprise, it's not, you would think it's the operations guys that would have the real problem, but the people we surveyed, they told us that it's the development team has as much trouble moving to this paradigm as the operations folks. Okay, so few observations on containers and orchestration. So as you know, a lot of the cloud service providers have substantial experience with containers, and they've been using them for a long time. I think we heard this morning Google's been using them for 15 years. That's just a long time, to be honest. Just remember that where you're going is that, well, first of all, in most cases, you're not building web scale or cloud scale applications like some of these service providers are. So your needs and your requirements and your goals are going to be a little bit different. So orchestrations, we find that most organizations are already dabbling in containers. In many cases, as I said, these may or may not be cloud native, but they're very, very infrequently are they using orchestration today. We think that will change. But for these monolithic applications that they pick up and they plunk into a container, they don't necessarily need the orchestration. Okay, lift and shift. There's a lot of lift and shift happening. That's going to go on for a few years, and probably more than a few years, probably 10 years. But in any event, that's part of what's going to happen here. But the rest of the stuff that you're building net new, the cloud native apps, they're not going to be lift and shift, obviously. So we find today less than 10% of the containers that are in use in enterprises are using orchestration to manage them. That will change going forward. By 2020, about 50% of the organizations that are using containers will have orchestration tools in place. And finally, we expect cloud native applications, they're almost always going to be running in a containerized infrastructure, and they're going to be using something like Kubernetes or some other orchestration mechanism. And by the way, I'm not picking winners or losers in terms of the orchestration, but I will say that the momentum we've seen with Kubernetes gives us a lot of confidence that that's going to be one of the survivors of the technology going forward. So let me just wrap up with a few thoughts on essential guidance for you. So number one, open source software, it's, as you saw from my slide showing Linux, for example, we really believe it's the foundation of which most software products and services will be built in the future. So there's this notion of this Darwinism, if you will, a Darwinism that has to take place in every single open source market. So you wind up with multiple technologies that compete for essentially for the winning position, or certainly the first and second. Right now we have got at least 3 and probably more like 4 or 5 orchestration technologies that are in the market. They can't all survive. Long term, some of them have to go because it's just the way the industry works. We can't have that much complexity in our infrastructure. So watch that space, but again, we think that Kubernetes is going to be one of the survivors. So containerized application development, if you're only just getting started, don't feel like you're behind. In fact, if you're already thinking about getting started with container technology, you are among the bleeding edge. And the folks that already have things that are in use or potentially in production, you're way, way out there. So don't feel like you're behind if you're just getting started. Existing apps, as I mentioned earlier, they're not going to be rebuilt. They're probably going to be containerized and packaged, but we're going to extend them and use them as services for other applications that are being built. And finally, 2 more, mix of on-prem, off-prem. This is going to be the norm going forward. We do think that a lot of the stuff you have in your data centers today, not all of it's going to go out into public cloud. Some of it's going to stay in your data centers. You're not necessarily going to expand your data centers, but there's going to be some applications, some sets of data that are going to be just better off running in your corporate data center. So expect that to be around for a long time to come. Okay, and this is the last bullet point. So we expect to see a scale out and this notion of regulatory insensitive applications. So if you don't have a lot of regulatory compliance for the applications, those are the things that are going to move out the public cloud infrastructure first. Certainly things that have more regulatory concerns are the things that tend to be held closer to home. So with that, I'm finished my presentation. I've got about 35 seconds left on the clock. Can I take a question or two? Sure. OK, I think I got one, so I'll take one. No? OK, well, I'll take that as no. OK, so OK, we do have one.
Thanks, Al. So Al, I was following your reports from IDC as part of my job, like on a regular basis. So what is your take on the current trend when enterprise have a choice going private cloud versus public? And where it's going, basically? Which one will take a preference in the next 3 years or so?
So enterprises are building private cloud for a lot of the applications. They're uncomfortable moving into public cloud infrastructure. I think you'll see both being used, but there's a place for both technologies. Over the long term, public cloud infrastructure will increasingly win, but it's not a yes or no, and it's not something that snaps from day to day. So, okay, so I am out of time, but if anybody wants to catch me for a question, I'll be here through the rest of the day. So thank you for your time. Thank you, Redbeard, for allowing me to come up and speak.